You know what's wild? Right now, as you're settling into bed, maybe scrolling through your phone one last time before sleep takes you, you're following rules that were written by people who died 700 years ago. People who never saw a light bulb. People who thought bathing was dangerous. People who believed that Earth was flat and that demons caused headaches. And yet, somehow, their bizarre medieval logic still controls parts of your daily life in ways you've never even questioned. Tonight, we're going on a journey through time. A journey that'll blow your mind and maybe, just maybe, help you drift into the most interesting dreams you've had in months. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you want, and let me tell you about the absurd medieval rules that still run your life in the 21st century. But first, if you're enjoying this deep dive into history's strangest corners, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for where this story goes. Let's start with something you did today without even thinking about it. You woke up this morning, stumbled to the bathroom, and brushed your teeth. Simple, right? Modern, hygienic. Except here's the kicker. The reason you brush your teeth isn't really about dental health. Not originally, anyway. Back in medieval Europe, around the year 1200, there was this wild belief that your mouth was literally a gateway to your soul. The monks and clergy were obsessed with this idea. They believed that demons could enter your body through your mouth while you slept, especially if your breath was foul. So they created these elaborate mouth-cleaning rituals that had nothing to do with cavities and everything to do with spiritual warfare. The priests would chew on these sticks from specific trees, usually willow or oak, that they believed had holy properties. They'd scrub their tongues with rough cloth dipped in wine mixed with herbs, not for fresh breath in the way we think about it, but because they genuinely thought they were scrubbing away demonic influence. They called this practice purifying the gateway. Now here's where it gets absolutely bonkers. The Catholic Church, which basically ran Europe like a massive corporation at the time, started spreading this practice to regular people. But they had an ulterior motive that had nothing to do with demons. See, the church owned massive plots of land where these special trees grew. By convincing everyone they needed to clean their mouths with these holy sticks, they created an entire economy around something that didn't really need to exist. It was medieval marketing, plain and simple. And it worked so well that the habit stuck around for centuries, eventually morphing into modern toothbrushing. The tools changed, the reasons changed, but that fundamental action, that automatic ritual you do every morning, that's a medieval monk's demon-fighting technique that got a modern makeover. Think about that for a second. Every single morning, you're performing a ritual designed to fight off demons. How's that for a wake-up call? But let's dig deeper, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. The medieval period, roughly spanning from the 5th century to the late 15th century, was this bizarre time when superstition, religion, and genuine human ingenuity all collided in the messiest way possible. And the rules they created during this time, man, they were something else. Take the way you shake hands, for instance. You've done it 1,000 times. Someone extends their right hand, you grab it, you shake. It's universal, it's polite, it's professional. But why the right hand? Why the shaking motion? Why do we still do this? Welcome to medieval paranoia, my friend. In the 1300s, everyone carried a weapon, and I mean everyone. Knights had swords, peasants had daggers, merchants had small blades tucked into their belts. Violence could pop off at any moment. Because, let's be real, medieval life was brutal. The average lifespan was like 35 years, and a decent chunk of people died from straight up getting stabbed in random disputes. So someone clever came up with a solution. When you met someone, especially someone you didn't know, you'd extend your right hand, your weapon hand, showing it was empty. The other person would grab it, also showing their weapon hand was empty. Then you'd shake to prove there was nothing hidden up your sleeve, literally, because people would hide small blades up their sleeves. This wasn't a friendly gesture. This was a survival tactic. This was two people saying, Hey, I could kill you right now, but I'm choosing not to, so let's both agree not to murder each other during this conversation. And we still do it. At job interviews, at weddings, at business meetings, we're performing a medieval peace treaty every time we shake hands, and nobody thinks twice about it. But here's where the story gets even weirder. The handshake wasn't the only greeting gesture that came out of medieval paranoia. There was also the bow, the curtsy, and even the high five, though that last one is debated by historians. The bow and curtsy came from showing you weren't carrying weapons on your lower body. When a man bowed, he was exposing the back of his neck, the most vulnerable part of the body, showing trust. When a woman curtsied, she was lowering herself to show she had no weapon strapped to her legs under her dress, which was apparently a thing women did back then. Every polite gesture we have today, it's rooted in people trying not to get murdered. Let that sink in as you drift off to sleep tonight. Now, if you're still with me, and I hope you are because we're just getting started, let me tell you about one of the most ridiculous medieval rules that still affects your life today. And this one's gonna blow your mind because you literally encounter it every single day. Why do we drive on the right side of the road? Most people would say it's just a rule, a standard, something that makes sense for traffic flow. But the real reason goes back to medieval knights and their absolutely bizarre code of honor. Back in the day, knights would ride on horseback on the left side of the road. Why? Because most people are right-handed, and knights would carry their swords on their left hip. If they were riding on the left side of the road and they encountered an enemy coming from the opposite direction, their sword arm would be closest to that enemy, making it easier to draw their weapon and fight. Also, mounting and dismounting a horse was easier on the left side of the road because of how the saddles were designed and where the sword hung. If a knight tried to mount his horse from the right side, he'd literally stab himself with his own sword, which, yeah, pretty embarrassing way to go. So the rule became, ride on the left, keep your sword arm toward potential threats. This rule was so ingrained in medieval society that it became law in many places. England still drives on the left today because of this medieval knight logic. But then something wild happened in the 1700s. Teamsters in America, the guys who drove big freight wagons pulled by multiple horses, started sitting on the left rear horse so they could use their right hand to whip all the horses. When they sat on the left rear horse, they needed to travel on the right side of the road so they could see oncoming traffic and avoid collisions. So America switched to right side driving because of medieval sword fighting logic meeting colonial freight hauling economics. And when cars were invented, we just kept the same rules. Henry Ford didn't invent the driver's seat position, he inherited it from medieval knights and colonial horse drivers. Every time you get in your car, you're following rules written by men in armor who were worried about getting ambushed on dirt roads. Wild, right? Let me paint you a picture of medieval London around the year 1350. Close your eyes and imagine this with me. The streets are narrow, maybe 10 feet wide, made of packed dirt and stones. There's no sewage system, so people just throw their waste out the windows into the street. The smell is absolutely horrendous, like nothing you've ever experienced. There are pigs running around eating the garbage, dead animals rotting in alleys. The air is thick with smoke from thousands of cooking fires because every building is made of wood and everyone is trying to stay warm. In the middle of all this chaos, there's a market. Hundreds of people crowded together, yelling, bargaining, stealing. Merchants selling everything from bread to live chickens to mysterious healing potions that are definitely just wine mixed with random herbs. There's a guy getting whipped in the public square for stealing a loaf of bread. There's a woman being dunked in a pond because her neighbor accused her of being a witch. There are children, probably 7 or 8 years old, working as apprentices, learning brutal trades like butchering or blacksmithing. This is daily life. This is normal.
And in this absolute circus of chaos, people created rules. So many rules. Rules for everything. Because when your entire society is one bad harvest away from total collapse, you need structure. You need order, even if that order is completely insane.
One of these rules? The curfew. You know how some cities have curfews, especially for young people? That's straight from medieval times. In most medieval cities, there was a literal bell that rang at sunset called the curfew bell. When that bell rang, everyone had to go inside and put out their fires. Curfew literally means cover fire in Old French. Why? Because cities were made of wood and straw, and fires destroyed entire neighborhoods regularly. But also because the government didn't trust people to wander around at night. They thought people would meet up and plot rebellions or commit crimes or practice witchcraft. So they made it illegal to be outside after dark. If you got caught outside after curfew, you'd get arrested, maybe beaten, possibly thrown in a cell that was basically just a hole in the ground filled with rats and human waste. The punishment was severe because the fear was real. Those in power genuinely believed that allowing people to gather at night would lead to the collapse of society. And we still have curfews. We still have this idea that people being outside at certain times is inherently suspicious or dangerous. That's medieval fear-mongering that never went away, just got dressed up in modern language about public safety. Thoughtful pause. Speaking of medieval fear-mongering, let's talk about something that affects literally everyone watching this video right now. Let's talk about the work week. Why do we work 5 days a week? Why is the weekend 2 days? Why do we structure our entire lives around this specific rhythm? You might think it's based on productivity research or psychology or some kind of scientific understanding of human needs. Nope. It's because of a medieval interpretation of the Bible mixed with Jewish Sabbath traditions and early industrial capitalist greed. Here's how it went down. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church ran everything, and the church said that Sunday was the Lord's Day, a day of rest, based on the creation story in Genesis where God rested on the seventh day. So everyone got Sunday off. Not because employers were generous, but because the church would literally excommunicate you if you worked on Sunday. But here's the thing. Medieval people actually worked way less than we do now. There were so many religious holidays and feast days that the average medieval peasant worked maybe 150 days a year. The rest was festivals, holy days, saints' days, harvest celebrations. They partied more than they worked, honestly. Then the Protestant Reformation happened in the 1500s, and suddenly there's this idea that hard work is godly, that being productive is being faithful. The Protestants, especially the Calvinists, started preaching that idle hands were the devil's workshop. They cut down on all those festivals and holy days. Work became moralized. Being busy became a virtue. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, factory owners loved this Protestant work ethic stuff because it meant they could make people work 6 days a week, 12 to 16 hours a day, including children. It was brutal. People were literally dying from exhaustion. Workers started organizing, fighting back, demanding time off. In America, labor unions fought for decades to get a 2-day weekend. They didn't even win that fight until the 1930s, when Henry Ford, of all people, decided to give his workers Saturday and Sunday off. Not because he was nice, but because he realized people needed time off to go buy stuff. You can't be a consumer if you're working all the time. So, the 5-day work week, the thing that structures your entire existence, is a weird combination of medieval Catholic rules, Protestant guilt, Jewish tradition, and capitalist manipulation. It's not based on human biology. It's not based on productivity. It's based on centuries of religious and economic forces that just kind of congealed into this system that we all accept as normal. And honestly, medieval peasants had it better. They worked less, had more community, and partied way more. We somehow went backwards while thinking we were progressing. Gentle transition. Now, before we go further into this rabbit hole, and trust me, we're going way deeper, hit that like button if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, and drop a comment telling me which medieval rule has surprised you the most so far. I read every single comment, and I love hearing what you guys think.
All right. Let's talk about something you definitely do, but probably never questioned. Let's talk about why you knock on wood for good luck. This one's so medieval it hurts. Back in the Middle Ages, people believed that spirits lived in trees. Not like cute fairy spirits, but powerful, potentially dangerous entities that controlled nature, weather, harvests, all the important stuff. Different trees had different spirits with different personalities. Oak trees were considered especially powerful because they were associated with Thor in pagan tradition. And even after Europe converted to Christianity, people still believed oak trees had special protective qualities. So when someone said something boastful or mentioned something good that might attract jealous spirits or demons, they would literally run over to the nearest oak tree and knock on it, waking up the protective spirit to guard them from evil forces. This wasn't superstition to them. This was practical spiritual defense. This was medieval people's version of antivirus software for their souls. The practice was so common that it eventually got shortened to just knocking on any wood because people got lazy and didn't want to run to an oak tree every time they needed protection. And then it became a gesture, just knocking on whatever wooden surface was nearby. And then it became something we do without even thinking about it. So when you knock on wood, you're literally performing a pagan tree spirit summoning ritual that got watered down over 700 years. You're trying to wake up a Norse god to protect you from demons while sitting in your air-conditioned bedroom in the 21st century. The absurdity is beautiful, honestly. Let's shift gears and talk about food, because medieval food rules are absolutely insane, and you're still following some of them. Ever wonder why breakfast is called breakfast? It's because in medieval times, the Catholic Church declared that eating before morning mass was a sin. You were supposed to fast from sunset until after you attended church in the morning. When you finally ate after mass, you were literally breaking your fast. Break, fast, breakfast. This wasn't a suggestion. This was church law. If you ate before mass, you were committing a sin that could send you to hell. Monks would patrol neighborhoods, looking through windows, trying to catch people eating early. Neighbors would report each other for pre-mass snacking. It was absolutely wild. And this rule affected what people ate, too. Because you were fasting for so long, the first meal needed to be something substantial. That's why breakfast foods are often heavy: eggs, bread, meat, porridge. You were breaking a religious fast, so it needed to count. But here's the really crazy part. The church also had rules about what you could eat on certain days. On Fridays and during Lent, you couldn't eat meat, but fish was okay because, get this, medieval religious scholars didn't consider fish to be meat. They classified fish as basically vegetables from the sea. Why? Because fish are cold-blooded and meat supposedly came from warm-blooded animals. This arbitrary biological distinction meant that on days when meat was forbidden, people would eat fish, sometimes elaborate fish dishes that were way more luxurious than regular meat. This created a whole Fish on Friday tradition that millions of Catholics still follow today. Fast food restaurants offer fish sandwiches on Fridays during Lent because of a medieval religious ruling about blood temperature. McDonald's Filet-O-Fish exists because of medieval church law. Let that blow your mind for a second. But it gets weirder. Beavers were classified as fish by the medieval church because they lived in water. So during Lent, when meat was forbidden, people would eat beaver, and it was considered totally fine, religiously speaking.
Dolphins, seals, even barnacle geese were classified as fish. The barnacle goose thing is particularly insane because medieval people didn't know where geese migrated to, so they made up a legend that geese grew from barnacles on trees, which meant they were technically plants, which meant they were okay to eat during Lent. Medieval people created an entire fantasy biology to get around religious food rules, and some of those rules still affect what's on your dinner plate today.
You know what else is wild? The way we dress. The entire concept of formal wear, of dressing up for special occasions, is rooted in medieval class systems and sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws were actual legal codes that dictated what people could wear based on their social class. In medieval England, for example, only nobility could wear purple cloth because purple dye was expensive, made from rare sea snails, and therefore only the wealthy could afford it. If a peasant showed up wearing purple, they could be arrested, fined, or even executed for pretending to be above their station. Same with fur. Only certain classes could wear certain types of fur. Ermine was for royalty. Regular people could only wear rabbit or squirrel. Silk was restricted to the upper classes. The length of your sleeves, the style of your shoes, even the number of buttons on your jacket were regulated by law. These laws existed to maintain social order. The whole point was to make sure you could tell someone's social class just by looking at them. A peasant should look like a peasant. A noble should look like a noble. Any blurring of those lines was considered dangerous to society. And while we don't have sumptuary laws anymore, we still have dress codes. We still have this idea that certain clothes are appropriate for certain occasions, and certain clothes signal status. Why does a business suit signal professionalism? Because it evolved from the formal wear that nobility used to wear. Why are t-shirts and jeans considered casual? Because they evolved from working class clothing. When you put on a tie, you're literally wearing a medieval status symbol that's been updated for modern times. The tie serves no functional purpose. It doesn't keep you warm. It doesn't protect you. It's purely decorative, purely about signaling that you're a professional, that you're upper class, that you're respectable. Medieval peasants would look at our business casual dress codes and immediately understand what was happening. The clothes changed, but the system stayed exactly the same. Let me tell you about one of the most insane practices from medieval times that still affects you today, and this one's so embedded in modern life that you'll probably get defensive when I point it out. The education system. The entire way we structure schools, the way we teach children, the way we measure intelligence, it's all medieval, and it's all designed to create obedient workers, not free thinkers. Here's the history. In medieval times, education was controlled by the church. Monasteries ran schools where they trained young boys to become priests and monks. The curriculum was called the trivium and quadrivium: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But the real purpose wasn't to create well-rounded individuals. It was to create people who could read the Bible, understand church doctrine, and spread that doctrine to others. Students sat in rows. They memorized information. They recited it back to teachers. They were punished, often physically, for getting things wrong. The entire system was about conformity, about creating people who would fit into the existing church hierarchy and not question authority. And then, in the 1800s, during the Industrial Revolution, the Prussian education system took this medieval model and updated it for factories. They created a system where children were grouped by age, moved through grades like an assembly line, learned to follow bells and schedules, and were trained to sit still for long periods and follow instructions without question. This system spread across Europe and America because it was perfect for creating factory workers. You needed people who could show up on time, follow instructions, do repetitive tasks, and not ask too many questions.
The education system wasn't designed to create artists or philosophers or entrepreneurs. It was designed to create obedient employees. And we still use this system. Your kids sit in rows. They memorize information for tests. They're grouped by age, not ability. They follow bells. They ask permission to use the bathroom. They're trained to compete with each other for grades, not to collaborate. They learn that there's one right answer to every question, and that answer is whatever the authority figure says it is.
This is medieval church school, updated from modern capitalism. And we all just accept it as the only way to educate children, but it's not. It's just the way that benefits the people in power. Medieval monks would walk into a modern classroom and feel right at home. That should terrify you. Let's lighten things up a bit and talk about parties, because even our celebrations are medieval as hell. Birthday cakes with candles? Medieval. Back in the day, people believed that smoke carried prayers to heaven. So on your birthday, you'd light candles on a cake, make a wish, and blow them out, sending your wish up to God via the smoke. The entire ritual was a prayer mechanism. Wedding rings? Medieval. The circle represented eternity, and wearing a ring on the left ring finger was based on the belief that a vein in that finger, the vena amoris, or vein of love, ran directly to the heart. This is anatomically false, by the way. There's no special vein there, but medieval people believed it, so we still wear wedding rings on that finger. Throwing rice at weddings? Medieval. It was supposed to symbolize fertility and prosperity, blessing the couple with many children and wealth. We replaced rice with birdseed because rice was supposedly bad for birds, but the ritual remains the same. Wearing white at weddings? Not medieval, actually. That's Victorian from the 1800s. Before that, brides just wore their best dress, whatever color it was. But the idea that weddings need elaborate rituals and specific traditions, that's totally medieval. Even the bachelor party is medieval in origin. The night before a wedding, a groom would gather with his male friends for a stad night where they drink, feast, and basically say goodbye to his single life. The activities were different. They weren't going to strip clubs, they were probably wrestling or hunting or something. But the concept is identical. Every celebration we have is layered with medieval rituals we don't even recognize anymore. We're constantly performing ceremonies created by people who thought the sun revolved around the earth and that demons caused disease. Now here's something that'll mess with your head. Let's talk about time itself. Why is an hour divided into 60 minutes? Why is a minute divided into 60 seconds? Why do we structure time this way? The answer takes us back to ancient Babylon, but it was medieval scholars who brought this system to Europe and made it standard. Medieval monks needed a way to structure their prayer schedules. They prayed at specific times throughout the day and night, and they needed a precise way to measure those times. So they adopted the Babylonian base 60 system for dividing hours. But here's the thing, they didn't have clocks, not like we think of them. They had sundials, water clocks, candle clocks, all of which were incredibly imprecise. So these extremely specific time measurements were being tracked with incredibly vague instruments. It's like trying to measure a millimeter with a yardstick. The precision was theoretical, not practical. But they committed to it anyway because, again, medieval people loved rules and structure, even when those rules didn't make practical sense. The first mechanical clocks were invented in the 1300s, and they were placed in churches and monasteries to help regulate prayer times. These clocks would ring bells to signal the hours. That's where the word clock comes from, clocca, the Latin word for bell. So our entire system of time measurement, the thing that controls every aspect of your modern life, was created by medieval monks trying to figure out when to pray. Your alarm clock is descended from a monastery bell designed to wake up monks from midnight prayers. Every time you check the time on your phone, you're using a system created by people who measured time by watching shadows move across stone markers. The technology changed, but the underlying structure stayed exactly the same.
If you're enjoying this journey through the medieval origins of modern life, and I really hope you are, make sure you're subscribed to Dreamless Timelines. We do deep dives like this all the time, exploring the weird, forgotten corners of history that explain why the modern world is so strange. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one.
All right, let's talk about something darker. Let's talk about law and punishment, because our justice system is medieval in ways that are genuinely disturbing. The concept of prisons, of locking people up as punishment, is relatively modern. Medieval punishment was way more brutal and way more public. If you committed a crime, you'd be whipped in the town square, or put in stocks where people could throw rotten food at you, or mutilated or hanged or burned, depending on the severity of the crime. These punishments served two purposes. First, they caused suffering, which was seen as justice. But second, and more importantly, they were public spectacles designed to terrify everyone else into obedience. Medieval authorities wanted people to see what happened to criminals. They wanted that fear to keep society in line. Now, we don't do public executions anymore, at least not in most developed countries. But we still have this medieval idea that punishment should involve suffering, that justice means making criminals hurt. We still have the death penalty in many places. We still have prison systems designed to be harsh and dehumanizing. And here's the really medieval part. We still have this concept of outlaws. In medieval times, an outlaw was someone who had been placed outside the law's protection. They could be killed by anyone, robbed, attacked, and it wasn't a crime because they were literally outside the law. They were non-persons. We do this to felons today. Once you're convicted of a felony in America, you lose the right to vote in many states. You can't own a gun. You have to check a box on job applications marking you as a felon, which means most places won't hire you. You're placed outside the full protection and participation of society. That's medieval outlawry updated for the modern age. We took a 1,000-year-old system of social exclusion and just tweaked it enough to feel legitimate. And trial by jury? That's Norman England circa 1166. King Henry II established the jury system as a way to standardize justice across his kingdom. Before that, you'd have trial by ordeal. They'd make you hold hot iron or walk across hot coals or get thrown in water, and if you survived or didn't get burned too badly, you were innocent because God had protected you. The jury system was actually considered progressive because it replaced literal torture with community judgment. But it was still based on this medieval idea that a group of local people, probably not educated, probably prejudiced, could determine truth and justice. We still use this system. We still pull random people from the community, show them evidence, and ask them to decide someone's fate. And we act like this is the pinnacle of justice, like we couldn't possibly come up with anything better. Medieval kings would look at our court system and be like, "Yep, that's pretty much what we did. Nice job, guys." Let's talk about medicine, because this is where medieval thinking still kills people. You know what bloodletting is? It's when doctors would cut you open or use leeches to drain blood from your body because they believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, or humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. They thought you had too much of one and it was making you sick. This was mainstream medical practice for over 1,000 years. Doctors killed people with bloodletting. They weakened patients who were already sick. They spread infections. It was catastrophic. And they kept doing it because it was traditional, because it was what everyone believed, because questioning it felt dangerous. We don't do bloodletting anymore, thank God. But we still have medical practices based on tradition rather than evidence. We still have doctors who prescribe treatments because that's how we've always done it, rather than because there's solid research supporting it. The entire pharmaceutical industry is built on a medieval model of authority. Doctors are like the medieval clergy. They have specialized knowledge that regular people don't have. They use Latin terminology that sounds impressive, but is often just regular words made fancy, and we're supposed to trust them completely without question. I'm not saying doctors are bad. Modern medicine has done incredible things, but the structure, the hierarchy, the expectation of blind trust, That's all medieval. And it means that bad practices can persist for decades because no one questions the authority.
Medical myths persist too. The idea that you should feed a cold and starve a fever, medieval. The idea that cracking your knuckles causes arthritis, medieval-style myth with no scientific basis. The idea that you lose most of your body heat through your head, myth, based on a misinterpreted military study, but it persists because it sounds true. We like to think we're scientific now, that we're beyond superstition. But medieval thinking is still everywhere in medicine, hiding under a white coat and a stethoscope. Here's something that'll really bake your noodle. The way we think about mental illness is still deeply medieval. In medieval times, mental illness was seen as either demonic possession or moral failing. If you were depressed, anxious, or acting strangely, you were either filled with demons or being punished by God for your sins. The treatment was prayer, exorcism, or being locked away from society. We don't do exorcisms anymore, not in mainstream medicine, but we still stigmatize mental illness. We still treat it as something shameful, something to hide. We still lock people away in institutions when they're deemed too disruptive or dangerous. And the language we use? Fighting depression, battling anxiety. This is medieval warfare language applied to internal states. It positions mental illness as an enemy to be defeated, rather than a condition to be managed or understood. The entire concept of willpower, of just trying harder or being stronger to overcome mental health issues, is rooted in medieval morality. It's the idea that if you're suffering mentally, it's because you're weak, because you're not faithful enough, because you're not trying hard enough. This kills people. This prevents people from getting help. This makes them feel like their suffering is their fault. Medieval monks would understand our mental health stigma perfectly. They created it. We just secularized it and pretended we'd moved past it. Let's talk about something more concrete. Let's talk about cities and how medieval urban planning still controls where you live and how you move through space. Medieval cities were built around defense. Walls surrounded the city to keep enemies out. Streets were narrow and winding to confuse invaders and make it hard for armies to march through. Buildings were packed together tightly to maximize space within the protective walls. The city center was always the church or cathedral, the spiritual and social heart of the community. Around that, you'd have the market square, where commerce happened. Then you'd have different neighborhoods for different trades, the butchers in one area, the tanners in another, the blacksmiths somewhere else. This layout was practical for medieval life, but it created patterns that we still follow today. Modern cities still have downtown areas that were originally medieval city centers. They still have neighborhoods with specific characters that originated from medieval trade guilds. They still have street layouts that make no sense because they're following cow paths and defensive considerations that haven't been relevant for 500 years. Boston, for example, has notoriously confusing streets because it's built on medieval-style road patterns. Same with many European cities. They're following layouts designed for horses and carts and defending against armies, and we're trying to drive cars through them in the 21st century. And suburbs? Those are a reaction to medieval urban density. People wanted space, wanted to get away from the crowded, dirty city center, so they created these separate communities outside the walls, suburbs, literally below the city. The layout is different, but the concept is medieval. Even the way we zone cities, separating residential from commercial from industrial, is based on medieval guild systems. You didn't want the tannery, which smelled absolutely horrendous, near the bakery. You didn't want the blacksmith's forge near wooden houses, so you separated different activities into different zones. We still do this. We separate where people live from where they work, from where they shop. We create these isolated zones that require cars to navigate between them. We design cities for commerce and defense rather than for human connection and community.
Medieval city planners would look at modern urban sprawl and suburban developments and totally understand what we're doing. We're just doing it with cars instead of horses. All right, we're about halfway through this journey, and I want to talk about something that affects how you think about success, wealth, and what it means to live a good life: the Protestant work ethic. We talked about this briefly earlier, but it goes much deeper. In Catholic medieval theology, wealth was actually kind of suspicious. Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Monks took vows of poverty. Helping the poor was considered virtuous. Being too focused on accumulating wealth was seen as sinful, as greed.
But then Martin Luther and John Calvin came along in the 1500s with the Protestant Reformation, and they flipped the script. Calvin especially preached this idea of predestination, that God had already decided who was saved and who was damned, and there was nothing you could do to change it. But Calvin said you could look for signs of being chosen by God, and one of those signs was worldly success. If you were wealthy, if your business prospered, if you were productive and successful, that was evidence that God favored you. This created a completely new way of thinking about wealth and work. Suddenly, being rich wasn't sinful, it was a sign of God's blessing. Working hard wasn't just about survival, it was about proving your faith. Leisure became suspicious, resting became laziness. The entire moral framework flipped. And this Protestant work ethic became the foundation of capitalism. It spread through Europe, came to America with the Puritans, and became baked into American culture so deeply that most people don't even realize it's there. That feeling you get when you're not being productive, that guilt when you're relaxing, that sense that you should always be hustling, always grinding, always working towards something, that's Protestant theology from the 1500s mixed with medieval Catholic guilt. It's not natural, it's not universal, it's a specific cultural programming that we inherited from religious reformers who were reacting to medieval church practices. And it's making us miserable. Americans work more hours than medieval peasants did. We take less vacation time than any other developed country. We've internalized this idea that our worth is tied to our productivity, that we need to constantly prove ourselves through work. Medieval monks would be horrified at how we live. They understood the value of rest, of contemplation, of community. They had problems, lots of problems, but they weren't grinding themselves into dust for the approval of employers and the accumulation of wealth. We took their religious structure and turned it into an economic system that's eating us alive. Let's talk about marriage, because oh boy, marriage is medieval in the worst possible ways. In medieval times, marriage wasn't about love, it was about property, alliances, and producing legitimate heirs. Marriages were arranged by families, often when the couple were children. A 12-year-old girl would be married to a 30-year-old man because it benefited both families economically or politically. Women were literally property in these arrangements. When a woman married, everything she owned became her husband's property. Her father transferred ownership of her to her husband. That's what giving away the bride means at weddings. It's a symbolic transfer of ownership. The bride would wear white, starting in the Victorian era, to symbolize purity, which really meant virginity. Her value was tied to being unused goods. The groom would lift her veil to reveal his purchase. They'd be pronounced man and wife, not husband and wife, not two equal partners, but man and wife, as if being a wife was her entire identity. And we still do these rituals. Brides still get given away by their fathers. We still have this tradition of the bride changing her last name to her husband's, erasing her family identity and taking his. We still have engagement rings, which originated as a man's financial investment in a woman, a down payment on marriage. Now, obviously, modern marriage is different in many ways. Women have rights. Marriages can be based on love. People can marry whoever they want, regardless of gender, in many places. But the rituals, the traditions, the underlying structure,
It's all medieval property transfer ceremonies dressed up in romantic language. And the expectations are medieval too. The idea that marriage is forever, till death do us part, comes from the medieval Catholic Church, which banned divorce. You were stuck with your spouse no matter how miserable you were, because the church said so. We've relaxed that rule, obviously. Divorce is legal, but there's still massive social pressure to make marriages work, to stay together even when it's not healthy, because of this medieval idea that marriage is a sacred, permanent bond that shouldn't be broken. People stay in bad marriages because of tradition, because of religious pressure, because of social expectations that are literally hundreds of years old. They sacrifice their own happiness and well-being to uphold a medieval institution that was never designed for their benefit in the first place.
Here's something that'll make you uncomfortable. Let's talk about gender roles. Medieval society had extremely rigid ideas about what men and women should be and do. Men were warriors, leaders, workers. Women were mothers, homemakers, supporters. Men were rational, strong, dominant. Women were emotional, weak, submissive. This wasn't just social custom, this was theology. The church taught that women were literally created from man's rib to be his helper. Women were closer to sin because Eve ate the forbidden fruit first. Women were dangerous because their sexuality could tempt men away from God. So, women needed to be controlled. They couldn't own property. They couldn't hold positions of authority. They couldn't make decisions about their own lives. They were perpetual minors, always under the authority of a father, husband, or brother. And these ideas persist. We like to think we've moved past them, that we're gender equal now. But the structures are still there. Women still do most of the unpaid labor in households, cooking, cleaning, childcare. Women are still underrepresented in leadership positions. Women are still paid less than men for the same work. Women are still judged more harshly for their appearance, their sexuality, their choices. The language changed. We don't say women are property anymore, but the underlying medieval logic is still operating. Women are still expected to be nurturing, to prioritize family over career, to be pleasant and agreeable. Men are still expected to be providers, to be strong and unemotional, to dominate. These gender roles hurt everyone. They limit what men can be and feel. They constrain women's opportunities and autonomy. They create these narrow boxes that nobody actually fits into comfortably. But we keep enforcing them because they're traditional, because they're natural, because they're how things have always been done. Except, they haven't always been done this way. They've been done this way since medieval Christian theology codified these roles and made them seem divinely ordained. Every time someone says boys will be boys, or asks a woman when she's going to settle down and have kids, they're repeating medieval gender ideology. Every time a man feels like he can't cry or show vulnerability, he's trapped in a medieval definition of masculinity. Every time a woman feels guilty for prioritizing her career, she's responding to medieval expectations about what women should value. We're living in the 21st century with 13th century programming, and it's making all of us miserable. Let me tell you about one of the most insidious medieval concepts that still controls your life. The idea of social hierarchy, that some people are just inherently better than others. In medieval times, society was divided into three estates: the clergy, who prayed, the nobility, who fought, and the peasants, who worked. This was considered the natural order, ordained by God. You were born into your estate, and you stayed there. A peasant couldn't become a noble wouldn't become a peasant. Your position in society was fixed. This was called the Great Chain of Being. God was at the top, then angels, then humans in their various ranks, then animals, then plants, then minerals. Everything had its place, and disrupting that order was considered not just wrong, but literally evil.
a rebellion against God's design. The rich were rich because God wanted them to be rich. The poor were poor because God wanted them to be poor. If you were suffering, it was God's plan. If you were thriving, it was God's blessing. Your circumstances weren't the result of systemic issues, or luck, or exploitation. They were divine will. This ideology justified everything. It justified nobles living in castles while peasants starved. It justified the church accumulating massive wealth while preaching poverty. It justified kings claiming absolute power because it was all part of God's plan, and questioning it was questioning God. And we still think this way. We still have this idea that wealth and success are somehow deserved, that they reflect personal virtue. We still blame poor people for being poor, as if their circumstances are their fault. We still assume that rich people must have worked harder or been smarter, rather than acknowledging the role of inheritance, privilege, luck, and exploitation. The language changed. We don't say divine right anymore. We talk about meritocracy, about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, about the American dream, but it's the same underlying ideology. It's the same justification for inequality. It's the same refusal to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the system is rigged in favor of people who already have power.
You know what's really wild? Conspiracy theories. The very concept of conspiracy theories is medieval. In medieval times, when something bad happened, a plague, a failed harvest, a military defeat, people needed an explanation. And the explanation was usually that some evil force was working against them. Jews were accused of poisoning wells during the Black Death. Women were accused of being witches who caused storms or made cows stop producing milk. Heretics were accused of undermining society and angering God. These accusations led to massacres. Thousands of Jews were killed during plague outbreaks. Thousands of women were burned as witches. Entire communities of religious minorities were wiped out. And the logic was always the same. Things are bad, therefore someone must be making them bad on purpose. We can't just be experiencing natural disasters or bad luck or poor decisions. No, there must be a secret conspiracy of evil people working against us. This same logic drives modern conspiracy theories. Governments are secretly controlled by shadowy elites. Vaccines are secretly dangerous. Elections are secretly rigged. There's always some hidden evil force, some secret group with nefarious intentions. And just like in medieval times, these conspiracy theories cause real harm. They lead to violence. They undermine trust in institutions. They make it impossible to solve actual problems because people are focused on fighting imaginary enemies. The medieval mind couldn't accept that sometimes bad things just happen, that complexity and chaos are part of life, that not everything has a clear villain. We still can't accept that. We still need someone to blame, some evil force to fight against. Medieval peasants blamed witches for their problems. Modern people blamed the Illuminati or Big Pharma or the deep state. The names changed, the psychology didn't. If you're still listening, still drifting along with me on this journey through the medieval origins of modern life, I want to take a moment to say thank you. Drop a comment below and let me know what's surprising you most. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come on, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button. We've got so many more stories to tell. All right, let's talk about something lighter but equally weird. Let's talk about sports. Medieval people loved violent sports. They had tournaments where knights would joust, trying to knock each other off horses with lances. They had sword fighting competitions. They had archery contests. And they had this game called mob football, which was basically hundreds of people in neighboring villages trying to get an inflated pig's bladder to a goalpost by any means necessary. It was brutal. People died playing mob football. These weren't just games. They were training for war, displays of strength and outlets for aggression. They were also social events where different classes would mix, where bets would be placed,
where reputations were made and destroyed. Modern sports are direct descendants of these medieval competitions. Football, soccer, rugby, they all evolved from mob football. Boxing and wrestling are refined versions of medieval combat sports. Even chess, which we think of as this intellectual game, was originally designed as a war simulation. And the culture around sports? That's medieval too. The tribalism, the loyalty to teams, the willingness to fight rival fans, that's medieval village rivalry. The betting, the fantasy leagues, the obsessive following of statistics, that's medieval tournament culture. The way we pay athletes absurd amounts of money and treat them like celebrities, that's how medieval society treated champion knights. Sports are literally medieval warfare made into entertainment. We're watching people enact combat scenarios for our amusement, just like medieval nobility watched jousting tournaments. The violence is slightly more regulated, but the core concept is identical. And the Olympics? That's medieval chivalry on a global scale. The opening ceremonies with all their pageantry and national pride? Medieval tournament openings. The medals and honors? Medieval titles and recognition. The idea that athletic competition builds character and represents national greatness, straight from medieval knightly ideology.
Every time you watch a game, you're participating in a medieval tradition of ritualized combat as entertainment. You're playing the role of a medieval noble watching their champion fight for glory. Let's talk about language, because even the words you speak are shaped by medieval power structures. English, as we know it today, is a product of the Norman conquest of 1066. When William the Conqueror invaded England, he brought French as the language of the ruling class. For centuries, French was the language of the court, the law, the church. English was the language of peasants. This created a linguistic divide that we still see today. Words related to power and authority tend to come from French. Words related to common life tend to come from Old English. Look at animals and food. The live animals have English names from the peasants who raised them: cow, pig, sheep. But the meat has French names from the nobles who ate them: beef, bœuf, pork, mutton, mouton. Peasants raised the animals, nobles ate them, and the language reflects that power dynamic. Same with law and governance. Almost all legal terminology comes from French or Latin: court, judge, jury, justice, attorney, plaintiff, defendant. These were all Norman French words because the legal system was controlled by Norman conquerors. Even the words we use to describe social class come from this divide. Noble is French, peasant is French. Villain, which now means a bad person, originally meant a person who lived in a village, a commoner, someone of low class. The very structure of English reflects medieval class warfare, and we don't even notice it. We speak this hybrid language that was created by conquest and centuries of social stratification, and we think it's just neutral, just how language works. But it's not neutral. Every language carries the history of power within it. Every word choice reflects centuries of decisions about who matters and who doesn't. Here's something that'll really get you thinking. The concept of privacy, of having a private life separate from public life, is actually pretty recent, and it's a reaction to medieval culture where privacy barely existed. In medieval times, most people lived in one-room houses with their entire family, multiple generations sleeping in the same space. No separate bedrooms, no bathrooms, obviously. Just one shared room where everything happened: eating, sleeping, working, even sex. Nobles had more space, but even they didn't have privacy as we understand it. Castles had great halls where everyone gathered. Bedrooms were semi-public spaces where servants and courtiers would be present. There was no concept of private space where you could be alone. Even your thoughts weren't considered private. The church claimed authority over your inner life. Confession meant revealing your private thoughts and desires to a priest. Heresy meant having unauthorized opinions.
Your mind was subject to religious authority. The idea that you have a right to privacy, that your thoughts are your own, that you can close a door and be alone, that's a relatively modern concept that emerged as people started pushing back against medieval communal living and religious authority. And now we're losing it again. Social media has made our private lives public. Surveillance technology tracks our movements and behaviors. Companies collect data on our thoughts and preferences. We're voluntarily surrendering the privacy that people fought for centuries to establish. We're becoming medieval again, living in a panopticon where everyone can see what everyone else is doing, where privacy is suspicious, where having secrets means you're hiding something wrong. Medieval people would understand social media instantly. It's the village square, the public space where everyone knows everyone's business and reputation is everything. We just made it digital. Let's talk about something that affects you every single day: the 40-hour work week and the concept of overtime. We talked about the weekend earlier, but the structure of the workday itself is medieval. In medieval times, work was structured around daylight. You woke at dawn, worked until dusk with breaks for meals. The concept of working specific hours didn't really exist because timekeeping was imprecise. But monasteries needed precise schedules for prayer, so they divided the day into canonical hours: matins at midnight, lauds at 3 a.m., prime at 6 a.m., and so on throughout the day. This created a structure where time was divided into specific periods for specific activities. When mechanical clocks were invented and placed in churches, this structure spread to secular life. Workdays became more regimented. You were expected to work certain hours, be present at certain times. Your time was no longer your own. It belonged to your employer, to the church, to the social structure.
The Industrial Revolution intensified this. Factory owners wanted maximum productivity, so they extended work hours to 12, 14, 16 hours a day. Children worked these hours. People literally died from exhaustion. Labor movements fought back, eventually establishing the 8-hour workday and the 40-hour work week in the early 1900s. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will was their slogan. But this was still based on medieval time structuring. It was still dividing the day into thirds, still organizing life around work schedules, still giving employers authority over huge portions of our waking hours. And the concept of overtime? That's just modern feudalism. In medieval times, lords could demand extra labor from peasants during harvest season or for special projects. It was called corvée labor, required unpaid work beyond your normal obligations. Overtime is the same thing with monetary compensation. Your employer can demand extra hours from you beyond your normal schedule. You get paid more, sure, but you're still expected to sacrifice your personal time when the boss demands it. We think we're free because we get paid, because we can theoretically quit, but the structure is the same. Someone else controls our time. Someone else decides when we work and for how long. We've just internalized it so deeply that we don't even recognize it as control. Medieval peasants worked fewer hours per year than modern Americans. Let that sink in. We have all this technology, all this productivity, and we work more than people living in literal feudalism. Let's talk about religion and secularism, because even atheism is shaped by medieval Christianity in ways most people don't realize. Medieval Christianity wasn't just a religion, it was a total system that explained everything. Where did the universe come from? God created it. Why do we exist? To serve God. What happens when we die? Heaven or hell, depending on how well you served God. What should we do with our lives? Follow God's commandments. It was comprehensive. It answered every question. It provided meaning, purpose, community, structure. It was the operating system of medieval life. When the Enlightenment happened in the 1600s and 1700s, people started questioning this system. Science provided new explanations for natural phenomena. Philosophy proposed new ethical frameworks.
The authority of the church was challenged. But here's the thing, the structure remained. Secular ideologies often just swapped out God for something else while keeping the same framework. Marxism replaced God with historical materialism, but kept the same structure of revealed truth and ultimate purpose. Humanism replaced God with humanity. Even modern atheism often operates within Christian frameworks. The idea that there's one correct way to understand reality, that we're progressing towards some better future, that individuals have inherent dignity and rights, these are all concepts that emerged from Christian theology and got secularized. The very idea that you need a comprehensive belief system that answers all questions, that's a Christian concept. Many pre-Christian and non-Christian cultures were fine with multiple incompatible belief systems coexisting. They didn't need one unified theory of everything. So even if you're not religious, even if you actively reject religion, you're probably still thinking within frameworks created by medieval Christianity. You're just using different vocabulary. The categories we think about the world, the questions we think are important, the ways we structure meaning and morality, it's all descended from medieval Christian theology, even when it's explicitly rejecting that theology. Here's something that might make you hungry. Let's talk about how medieval food rules still control what you eat and when. We already talked about breakfast and fish on Friday, but there's so much more. The entire concept of 3 meals a day is relatively recent and not universal. Medieval people often ate 2 meals, dinner around midday and supper in the evening. Breakfast was for children, the sick, or people doing heavy labor. The 3-meal structure became standard during the Industrial Revolution when work schedules demanded it. But the names of the meals, their relative importance, and a lot of the foods we associate with them are medieval. Dinner was the main meal in medieval times, eaten in the middle of the day. It was a big social event with multiple courses for the wealthy. Supper was lighter, eaten before bed. But as work schedules changed, dinner moved to the evening, and lunch became the midday meal. Yet we still call the evening meal dinner in many places, or supper in others, reflecting this medieval tradition.
The foods themselves carry medieval class distinctions. White bread was for the wealthy, because white flour was expensive and time-consuming to produce. Dark bread was for peasants. We still consider white bread more refined, even though whole grain is healthier. Sugar was incredibly rare and expensive in medieval times, reserved for the wealthy and used in medicine. The ability to serve sweet foods was a status symbol. We still associate elaborate desserts with special occasions and luxury, a direct continuation of medieval status signaling through sugar. And spices. Medieval nobles put spices on everything, not because it tasted good, but because spices were expensive imports from far away, and using them showed wealth. The more heavily spiced a dish, the more prestige it carried. We're still doing this with expensive ingredients like saffron or truffle oil. Even the way we present food is medieval. The idea of multiple courses, of specific orders for serving dishes, of pairing certain foods with certain drinks, that's all from medieval feast culture. We're recreating medieval banquets every time we have a formal dinner. Fast food is actually the most medieval thing we eat. Medieval people had street vendors selling hot food to workers who didn't have time or resources to cook at home. Meat pies, pastries, roasted nuts, ale, it was grab-and-go food for busy people. We just industrialized it and added drive-thrus. Every time you grab a burger on your lunch break, you're participating in a medieval tradition of quick, cheap, convenient food for working people. The ingredients changed, but the concept is identical. Let's talk about something that's going to sound really out there, but I promise it'll make sense. Let's talk about how medieval thinking affects modern technology. You'd think technology would be the one area completely free from medieval influence, right? Wrong. The entire structure of the internet, social media, even AI development is shaped by medieval concepts. Take social media hierarchy. Likes, followers, verification badges.
That's medieval status signaling updated for the digital age. In medieval times, you'd show status through clothing, jewelry, the size of your house. Now you show it through follower counts and engagement metrics. The blue checkmark on Twitter or Instagram? That's literally a modern version of a noble's seal or coat of arms. It's an official mark of authenticity and status granted by an authority. Medieval nobles would instantly understand verification badges. And algorithms, those are basically digital versions of medieval gatekeepers. In medieval times, guilds controlled who could practice certain trades. The church controlled who could publish books. Nobles controlled who had access to power and resources. Now, algorithms control who sees your content, who gets opportunities, who becomes visible. We talk about the algorithm like medieval people talked about fate or God's will. The algorithm blessed me. The algorithm is punishing me. We've created these incomprehensible systems that control our lives, and we relate to them the same way medieval people related to divine providence. Even the structure of tech companies is medieval. You've got the visionary founder, like a king or religious prophet. You've got the inner circle of executives, like nobles or cardinals. You've got the workers, like peasants or monks, doing the actual labor, while those above extract the value. And tech culture's obsession with disruption and innovation, that's Protestant Reformation energy. Challenge the old order, break with tradition, create something new. It's the same revolutionary spirit that split Christianity, just applied to industry instead of religion. Medieval people would look at Silicon Valley and see a familiar power structure with new window dressing, feudalism with better graphics. Now here's where things get really interesting. Let's talk about how medieval concepts of purity and contamination still control modern life in unexpected ways. Medieval people were obsessed with purity, not just physical cleanliness, but moral and spiritual purity. They believed that impure things could contaminate pure things through contact. This is why they segregated lepers, why they had rules about who could touch what, why they had elaborate rituals for purification. This wasn't just superstition, it was a whole system of thought about how the world worked. Good things could be corrupted by bad things. Pure things needed to be protected from impure things. Categories needed to be maintained. And we still think this way. We might not use religious language, but the logic is identical. Think about how we treat homeless people. We're uncomfortable when they're in nice neighborhoods because we fear they'll contaminate those spaces. Same medieval purity logic about keeping the impure separate from the pure. Think about how we treat criminals. Once someone has a criminal record, they're permanently marked as contaminated. They need to check that box forever, warning others of their impurity. Think about food safety and the 5-second rule. That's literally medieval contamination theory. Something pure touches something impure and becomes corrupted. Even the way we think about virginity is medieval purity logic. The idea that sexual contact fundamentally changes someone, that they go from pure to impure, that this change is permanent. That's medieval Christian theology about the body and sin. Modern hygiene culture has taken medieval religious purity concepts and secularized them. Hand sanitizer is holy water. Antibacterial soap is a purification ritual. We're obsessed with eliminating germs, not just because of actual health concerns, but because of deep cultural programming about purity and contamination.
This extends to ideas, too. We talk about being exposed to bad ideas as if they're contagious diseases. We worry about ideas spreading like contamination. We want to keep pure minds safe from impure thoughts. Medieval monks would totally get our modern obsession with purity. They created it. We just replaced demons with germs and sin with social deviance. All right, we're getting into the final stretch of this journey, and I want to talk about death, because our entire relationship with death is shaped by medieval Christianity.
Medieval people lived with death constantly. The average lifespan was short. Infant mortality was high. Plagues swept through regularly. Violence was common. Death wasn't hidden away. It was part of daily life. But it also terrified them, because the church taught that what happened after death was the most important thing about your existence. Heaven or hell, eternal bliss or eternal torture, depending on how you lived and whether you had proper last rites. This created an entire industry around death. The church sold indulgences, essentially get-out-of-hell passes for exorbitant prices. They required elaborate funeral rituals. They built cathedrals and monasteries with money donated by people terrified of damnation. Fear of death became a massive source of power and wealth. And we're still doing this, just in secular forms. The funeral industry is massive, charging thousands of dollars for caskets, services, plots. We embalm bodies to preserve them, even though it's unnecessary, because we can't accept decay and decomposition. We hide death away in hospitals and nursing homes. We don't let children see dead bodies. We sanitize death, remove it from daily life, pretend it's not happening. That's a continuation of Victorian practices that were themselves continuations of medieval ideas about death being spiritually dangerous and physically contaminating. The memorial culture, the way we maintain graves and monuments, the idea that we need to preserve the memory of the dead, that's all medieval. Before Christianity spread through Europe, many cultures had different relationships with death and memory. Even grief has rules that are medieval in origin. The Victorian mourning period, where widows wore black for a year, was based on medieval Christian mourning practices. We've relaxed those rules, but we still judge how people grieve, still expect certain performances of sadness. And life insurance? That's medieval indulgences updated for capitalism. Pay money now to protect your loved ones later. It's the same exchange, just without the explicit religious framework. We're terrified of death in ways that medieval Christianity taught us to be, and we've built entire industries around managing that fear. Let's talk about something that's probably affecting you right now as you listen to this. The concept of productivity, of making the best use of your time, of optimization and efficiency. Medieval monks were the original productivity gurus. They had detailed schedules, dividing the day into precise periods for prayer, work, study, meals, and sleep. They created systems for managing time and tasks. They tracked their spiritual progress meticulously. Benedictine monasteries operated on the principle ora et labora, pray and work. Every moment had a purpose. Idle time was considered sinful. The goal was to use every minute of the day in service to God. This monastic discipline was considered the peak of spiritual achievement. These were people who had transcended worldly concerns and dedicated themselves entirely to divine service.
And then the Protestant Reformation took this monastic productivity culture and applied it to everyone. Remember the Protestant work ethic? It took the monk's life and said everyone should live this way. Everyone should be constantly productive, constantly working, constantly using their time efficiently. The Industrial Revolution weaponized this. Time became money. Efficiency became paramount. Productivity became the measure of human worth. And now we have productivity apps, life hacks, optimization strategies. We track our habits, measure our output, try to eliminate wasted time. We feel guilty for relaxing. We're always hustling, always grinding, always trying to do more. This is monastery life applied to secular capitalism. We're all monks now, except instead of serving God, we're serving employers and the market economy. Medieval monks chose that life. They took vows. They entered monasteries voluntarily.
We were born into this system and told it's just how life works, that being constantly productive is normal and healthy. It's not. It's a specific cultural practice that was created for a specific purpose by specific people, and it's been generalized to everyone, even though it's actually kind of miserable for most people. If you've made it this far in the journey, thank you for sticking with me. We're going deep tonight, exploring the roots of the world we live in. If this is resonating with you, make sure to like this video and leave a comment. And seriously, subscribe to Dreamless Timelines. We're building a community of people who want to understand history not as disconnected facts, but as the living foundation of our present reality. Let me tell you about something that's probably in your house right now: furniture, and specifically, how we arrange it. Medieval great halls had a high table at one end, where the lord and his family sat, elevated above everyone else. Lower tables extended perpendicular, where lesser nobles and retainers sat in order of their status. The further from the high table, the lower your status. This wasn't just practical, it was a visual representation of social hierarchy. Everyone could see where everyone else ranked just by where they sat. And we still do this. The head of the table at family dinners is the position of authority. Conference rooms have head of table positions. Restaurants have good tables and less desirable tables. Classrooms have the front, where you're engaged, and the back, where you're disengaged. We arrange furniture to create hierarchies, to establish positions of power and submission. The boss gets the big desk, the corner office, the good chair. Employees get cubicles and break rooms. Even living room furniture is arranged around a focal point, usually a TV now, but historically a fireplace. Just like medieval halls were arranged around the lord's position. We're still organizing space to reflect power and status, just unconsciously. And beds? The medieval practice was that higher status people had higher beds, literally. Nobility slept on elevated platforms. The higher your bed, the more important you were. We still make beds the focal point of bedrooms. We still invest in nice bed frames and headboards as status symbols. The size of your bed indicates status: twin, full, queen, king. We're still using furniture to signal where we sit in the social hierarchy. Medieval interior designers would walk into a modern home and immediately understand the power dynamics just by looking at the furniture arrangement.
Let's talk about one of the most pervasive medieval concepts that still controls modern life: the idea of authority itself. In medieval times, authority flowed from God down through a chain of command. God gave authority to the Pope, who gave it to bishops, who gave it to priests. God gave authority to kings, who gave it to nobles, who gave it to knights and lords. Authority was hierarchical, absolute, and unquestionable within its domain. You obeyed your priest because he represented God. You obeyed your lord because he represented the king. You obeyed the king because he represented divine will. Disobedience wasn't just breaking rules, it was sin, rebellion against the cosmic order. And this structure is still how we organize society. Teachers have authority over students, managers have authority over employees, police have authority over citizens, government has authority over everyone. We've secularized the language, but the structure is identical. Authority figures make rules, and subordinates are expected to obey. Questioning authority is seen as problematic, as disruptive. We teach children to obey authority figures unquestioningly, just like medieval peasants were taught to obey their lords. The entire criminal justice system is based on this. Breaking the law isn't just harmful actions, it's disobedience to authority. That's why victimless crimes exist. It's not about harm, it's about obedience. And we internalize this authority structure so deeply that we replicate it everywhere. Parents have absolute authority over children, bosses have authority over workers, experts have authority over public discourse. We're constantly looking for authority figures to tell us what to do, how to think, what to believe.
Medieval people would understand modern society instantly. We're still living in a hierarchical, authority-based system. We just pretend it's based on expertise and merit, rather than divine right. Let's talk about nationalism and patriotism, because these are just medieval feudal loyalty updated for the modern state. In medieval times, you were loyal to your lord. You would fight for him, die for him if necessary. This wasn't a choice, it was your obligation as his vassal. Your lord protected you, gave you land or position, and in return, you owed him absolute loyalty. This feudal bond was personal. You knew your lord. You probably saw him regularly. Your fates were directly connected. If he prospered, you prospered. If he went to war, you went to war. Then nation-states emerged in the late medieval period and early modern era. Instead of loyalty to a person, you had loyalty to a country, to an abstract concept, but the emotional structure was the same. You're expected to love your country, to be willing to die for it, to consider it the most important group you belong to. The flag is sacred, the anthem is sacred. Criticizing the country is seen as betrayal. This is feudal loyalty transferred from a lord to a state, and it uses the same tactics: national myths that glorify the past, rituals like pledging allegiance or singing anthems, symbols that must be respected, the idea that sacrificing yourself for the nation is the highest honor. Medieval knights died for their lord's ambitions. Modern soldiers die for national interests. The uniforms changed, the weapons got more advanced, but the fundamental relationship is identical. A centralized authority demands absolute loyalty and willingness to kill and die on its behalf. And we teach this to children. We have them pledge allegiance before they're old enough to understand what a nation even is. We tell them stories about heroes who died for their country. We make it seem natural and good to prioritize national identity over human solidarity. Medieval feudalism never ended, it just scaled up. Instead of thousands of small fiefdoms, we have hundreds of nation-states, but the logic is the same: loyalty, obedience, sacrifice for those in power.
Here's something that's going to sound crazy, but stick with me. The way we think about emotions, what's acceptable to feel and express, is deeply medieval. Medieval Christianity taught that emotions were dangerous. Anger was a sin. Lust was a sin. Pride was a sin. Envy was a sin. The 7 deadly sins were mostly emotions or emotional states. The ideal was to suppress your feelings, to achieve a state of calm submission to God's will. Monks would flagellate themselves to punish their bodies for having feelings. They'd pray for hours to overcome emotional responses. The goal was to transcend human emotion and achieve pure spiritual devotion. This created a culture where emotions were seen as weaknesses, as evidence of being controlled by your base nature rather than your higher spiritual self. Rational thought and emotional control were virtuous. Emotional expression was sinful and embarrassing. And we still believe this. We tell boys not to cry because emotions are weakness. We tell people to be professional, which means suppressing emotions at work. We medicate people who feel too much. We valorize being calm, collected, unemotional. Even the emotions we do allow are regulated by medieval Christian morality. Righteous anger is okay. Loving devotion is okay. Guilt and shame are practically required. But joy that's too exuberant? Suspicious. Sadness that lasts too long? Get therapy. Anger at authority? Unacceptable. We've created this hierarchy of acceptable and unacceptable emotions that comes straight from medieval Christian theology. And it's making us miserable because humans are emotional creatures. Suppressing emotions doesn't make them go away. It just makes them come out in unhealthy ways. Medieval monks tried to transcend their humanity through emotional suppression. Modern people are expected to do the same thing, just for different masters.
Instead of suppressing emotions for God, we suppress them for employers, for social expectations, for the appearance of having it all together. Let's talk about one of the most bizarre medieval hangovers in modern life: the way we treat names. In medieval times, your name had power. Knowing someone's true name gave you power over them, according to various traditions. This is why many cultures had public names and secret names. This is why naming ceremonies were important spiritual events. The church controlled naming through baptism. Your baptismal name was your official identity in the eyes of God and society. Changing your name was a big deal that usually required church approval. And last names, surnames, became fixed in the medieval period. Before that, people often just had one name, maybe with a descriptor: John the baker, Mary of Northampton. But as populations grew and administration became more complex, hereditary surnames became necessary. Those surnames usually indicated your father's name, Johnson, O'Brien, your occupation, Smith, Cooper, your location, Hill, Wood, or a personal characteristic, Strong, White. Your name literally described your place in society. We still use this system. We still pass down surnames patrilineally in most cultures, which is a medieval practice of tracking lineage through the male line. Women still change their names when they marry in many places, symbolically leaving their father's family and joining their husband's family. Your legal name is still your official identity, controlled by government bureaucracy that descended from church record-keeping. Changing your name legally is still a complex process that requires approval from authorities. And we still treat names as having power. Your credit score is attached to your name. Your criminal record is attached to your name. Your reputation is attached to your name. Your name is your identity in all official contexts. Dead naming trans people is considered violence because we understand intuitively that names have power, that forcing someone to use a name they reject is a form of control. Medieval people would totally get modern identity politics around names. They understood that names were about power, control, and social positioning. We're still having the same fights they had, just with slightly different parameters. Let me tell you about something that affects your daily life in ways you've never considered: architecture. The buildings you live and work in are shaped by medieval design principles. Medieval buildings were designed to inspire awe and reinforce hierarchy. Cathedrals had soaring ceilings to make you feel small before God. Castles had imposing walls to demonstrate the Lord's power. Even peasant cottages followed specific designs based on social position.
And we still build this way. Corporate headquarters have grand lobbies to intimidate and impress. Government buildings have columns and domes to project authority. Churches still use Gothic architectural elements to inspire reverence. The layout of buildings reinforces social hierarchy. The boss gets the top floor with the best view. Executives get offices. Regular employees get cubicles. The spatial arrangement reflects power dynamics. Even homes follow medieval design principles. The front of the house is public, presentable. The back is private, functional. We have great rooms that echo medieval great halls. We have master bedrooms that echo lords' chambers. And the separation of spaces by function? That's medieval. Kitchen separate from dining, bedrooms separate from living areas, bathrooms hidden away. Medieval castles had different rooms for different functions, organized by social propriety. Modern open-plan designs are actually a rebellion against medieval spatial organization. They're trying to break down those hierarchical separations, but even they follow rules about flow and zones that have medieval origins. The buildings around you aren't neutral. They're encoding social relationships and power dynamics in physical form, just like medieval architecture did. You're constantly moving through spaces designed to make you feel and behave in certain ways.
Let's talk about something that's going to make you uncomfortable. Disability, and how we treat people with disabilities. In medieval times, disability was seen as either divine punishment or a test from God. If you were born with a disability, it was because of sin, either yours or your parents. If you became disabled, it was God's will for reasons you might not understand. This meant disabled people were often ostracized, seen as cursed or murked by God. They couldn't participate fully in society. They were often dependent on charity, on the mercy of the church or wealthy benefactors. But there was also a contradictory belief that disabled people were closer to God, that their suffering made them holy. Some disabled people became revered saints or holy fools. Their disability was seen as a special spiritual state. And we still have both of these attitudes. We pity disabled people, see them as tragic, as less than. We make them dependent on charity and government assistance. We design our world without considering their needs, then act like they're the problem when they can't navigate spaces built for able-bodied people. But we also have this inspiration porn thing, where disabled people who do ordinary things are treated as inspirational heroes. We use their existence to make able-bodied people feel better about themselves. Both of these attitudes are medieval. Both treat disabled people as fundamentally different, as not fully human in the normal way. Both deny disabled people agency and normalcy. The medical model of disability, where disability is seen as a problem to be fixed, is medieval thinking. The body is broken, impure, needs to be healed or hidden. The social model, where disability is created by social barriers, is the rejection of that medieval framework. But most of society still operates on the medieval model. Disabled people are still fighting for the basic recognition that they're just people navigating a world built without considering them. Medieval attitudes toward disability never went away. We just medicalized them and pretended they're scientific rather than religious. All right, we're in the stretch now. Let's talk about something that ties a lot of this together: the concept of normal.
Medieval society had very clear ideas about what was normal and what was deviant. Normal was following church teachings, obeying your social superiors, fulfilling your role in the great chain of being. Deviant was heresy, rebellion, stepping outside your assigned position. Normal people were easy to categorize and control. Deviant people were threats to social order. The whole system was designed to maintain normalcy and punish deviation. And we still operate this way. We have ideas about normal bodies, normal behaviors, normal lives. People who deviate from those norms are treated as problems to be solved. Normal sexuality is heterosexual, married, reproductive. Other sexualities were long criminalized, pathologized, treated as mental illness or moral failing. We've made progress, but the baseline assumption is still heteronormativity. Normal gender is cisgender, conforming to the binary. People who don't fit are still fighting for basic recognition and rights. Normal life is education, career, marriage, children, retirement. People who don't follow this path are seen as incomplete, as failing at life. Normal bodies are able-bodied, within certain size ranges, conventionally attractive. Bodies that don't conform are seen as problems. The entire concept of normal is a tool of social control, a medieval inheritance that we've never questioned. Because if there's a normal, then there's also abnormal, deviant, wrong, and those categories can be used to exclude, oppress, and control. Medieval people would understand modern normalization perfectly. They invented it. They created the categories, the hierarchies, the systems of inclusion and exclusion. We just secularized them. Let's talk about one last thing before we wrap up this journey: hope. The very concept of hope, of believing things can get better,
of working toward a better future. Medieval Christianity taught that earthly life was suffering, a test, a trial. The real life was the afterlife. Heaven was where things would be good. Earth was just something to endure. This could have made people passive, accepting of suffering, and to some extent it did. But it also created this idea that there was a better world coming, that current suffering wasn't permanent, that if you held on and stayed faithful, everything would eventually be okay. This hope was directed toward the afterlife, but it created a template for thinking about the future. Things are bad now, but they'll get better eventually. Just keep faith, keep working, keep believing. Modern secular hope follows the same structure. We believe in progress, in eventual improvement. Things are bad now, but technology will solve our problems. Society will eventually become more just. The arc of history bends toward justice. This is secularized Christian eschatology. It's the same narrative of suffering now, redemption later, just without the explicit religious framework. And it serves similar functions. It keeps people hopeful enough to keep going, but not rebellious enough to demand immediate change. It directs energy toward an imagined future rather than present transformation. Medieval peasants were told to accept their suffering because heaven awaited. Modern workers are told to accept their suffering because retirement awaits, or because eventually society will progress, or because their children will have it better. Same structure, same function, same way of managing populations and maintaining systems that benefit those in power. But here's the thing. Hope isn't bad. Believing in possible futures isn't bad. What's problematic is when hope becomes a tool to prevent action, when it's used to make people accept unacceptable presence.
Medieval hope was a survival mechanism in a brutal world. Modern hope can be the same. But we need to be aware of how that hope is structured, where it comes from, and who benefits from us directing our energy toward imaginary futures instead of present realities. So, here we are, at the end of this long, strange journey through the medieval origins of modern life. We've covered so much ground tonight, from toothbrushing to trial by jury, from the work week to wedding rings, from gender roles to the very concept of time itself. The point of all this isn't to say that medieval people were stupid or that we haven't progressed at all. We have. In many ways, life is better now than it was then. We have medicine that actually works, technology that makes life easier, rights and freedoms that medieval people couldn't have imagined. But we also have to recognize that we're not as modern as we think we are. We're still carrying so much medieval baggage, still following rules written by people who lived in a completely different world, still organizing our lives around systems that were designed for completely different purposes. And the really wild part? Most people never question any of it. They just assume this is how things are, how they've always been, how they have to be. They don't realize they're performing rituals created to fight demons, following hierarchies established by feudal lords, organizing their time according to monastery schedules. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start noticing medieval logic everywhere, and that awareness gives you a choice. You can keep following these rules unconsciously, or you can start questioning them, pushing back against them, creating new ways of being that aren't based on thousand-year-old power structures. Maybe we don't need to work 40 hours a week. Maybe we don't need rigid gender roles. Maybe we don't need hierarchical authority in every aspect of life. Maybe we can create something new, something actually designed for the world we live in now, rather than the world medieval people lived in then. Or maybe we can't. Maybe we're too deeply programmed, too thoroughly medieval in our thinking. Maybe these patterns are so embedded that we'll keep recreating them even as we try to escape them. I don't know the answer, but I think it's worth asking the question. As you drift off to sleep tonight, as your consciousness fades and your mind starts to wander, think about all the medieval rules still running in the background of your life. Think about the invisible structures, the unquestioned assumptions, the traditions you follow without knowing why. Think about the medieval peasant who would look at your life and see so much that's familiar,
The same hierarchies, the same struggles, the same desperate hope for something better. Think about how different things could be if we really started over, if we questioned everything, if we built systems actually designed for human flourishing rather than social control. Or maybe don't think about any of that. Just let it wash over you. Let these ideas percolate in your subconscious. Let yourself drift into dreams where maybe, just maybe, you can imagine a world that's truly different. Because that's the power of knowing history. It shows you that nothing is natural, nothing is inevitable, nothing is just the way things have to be. Everything was created by people, which means everything can be changed by people. The medieval world ended. The systems we have now will end too. The question is what comes next, and whether we'll have any say in building it. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for staying curious, for questioning, for being willing to see the world in a new way. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's weird influence on modern life, hit that subscribe button. Join the Dreamless Timelines community. We've got so many more stories to explore, so many more hidden connections to uncover. Leave a comment telling me what surprised you most, what made you think differently, what medieval rule you're going to start questioning in your own life. I read every comment, and I love hearing your perspectives. And if you're feeling generous, hit that right button. It helps other people find these videos, helps the algorithm, which, as we discussed, is basically a medieval gatekeeper, helps that algorithm show this to people who might find it valuable. Until next time, sleep well, dream deep, and remember, question everything, especially the things that seem most normal, because normal is just medieval rules wearing a modern disguise. Good night.